welcome back to another episode in our Green Thumb Gardening Secrets video series. Today we're going to talk about potato storage. Let's get going. Since damaged potatoes will rot much faster, the first step in prolonging potato storage is harvesting carefully. I'll link to our harvest video in the description, but apart from knowing when and how to harvest, one of the main points it conveys is how not to damage your potatoes during that vulnerable time, so you don't ruin the storage quality of the precious crop you worked so hard to grow. And not only not to just puncture them, but also not to drop or bang them around so as not to bruise them. It's harder to tell on a potato, but potatoes bruise easily just like an apple and then rot faster in that spot, so be gentle. After you've harvested the potatoes and you've gently removed large clumps of soil without any rubbing or scrubbing that would damage the skins and invite early rot, lay them out 1 or 2 layers thick in a cool, dry, dark place, separating any potatoes that are noticeably damaged to be used right away. Inspect them every few days and remove any bad potatoes before their rot spreads to others. After a few weeks of drying there, the potatoes are ready for long-term storage. The main issues most people are trying to avoid, or at least mitigate, in long-term storage are greening, sprouting, shriveling, and rot. Keep in mind that potatoes will eventually sprout, shrivel, and rot no matter what you do, and some will rot soon after you harvest or soon after you put them in storage, even if you've done everything right. But there's a lot you can do to prolong the storage quality of the vast majority of your potatoes. So let's look at each of these possible problems and their solutions in more depth. Greening of both potato skins and flesh is caused by light exposure. The green itself isn't harmful, it's just chlorophyll, but it's a good indicator of increased levels of the toxin solanine, which is helpful to potatoes as a defense mechanism, but is fairly toxic to humans. If you're an adult, you may dismiss solanine toxicity as I often did in the past, since you likely only notice some nausea and diarrhea, but the more insidious effects, like inhibiting the breakdown of some neurotoxins, breaking down cell membranes, and affecting absorption in the small intestines, are more subtle, so will likely go unnoticed, but are much more detrimental, and can be even more harmful in small adults and children. Furthermore, solanine isn't confined to green areas. Again, the green isn't solanine, it's just chlorophyll. Green potatoes often have higher solanine levels throughout large areas of the tuber, and the potato will sometimes also increase the solanine to toxic levels when damaged, bruised, or exposed to too high or too low of temperatures. To avoid solanine toxicity then, store potatoes in the dark. Avoid damaging them, keep them out of temperature extremes, and compost those that are especially green. Sprouting is a result of too high of temperature. Ideal storage temperature is 40 to 45 degrees. Up to 50 is probably still okay, but much higher than that, and potatoes will be triggered to start sprouting. Low temperatures aren't great either. Temperatures under 40 degrees start turning the potato starches to sugars, which changes their taste and makes them discolor or darken when cooked. To avoid sprouting and sugaring, and to maximize storage time, use a nearby thermometer to keep your potatoes in 40 to 45 degree temps, moving them to cooler or warmer locations as needed. Shriveling is the result of too low of humidity. Ideal humidity is 90%. If you want to maximize keeping times, it's a good idea to keep a hygrometer or psychrometer nearby to keep track of humidity. If the humidity drops too low, you can place a shallow pan full of water nearby or spray or sprinkle water on a cement, dirt, or gravel floor nearby to raise the humidity. Some old-timey sources recommend keeping damp sphagnum moss in layers between the potatoes with a final layer over the top, and even lightly spraying the tubers themselves. But who has extra fresh sphagnum moss? And spraying tubers directly seems like it's inviting rot. In any case, all of this moisture creates great conditions for mold and bacteria growth, which brings us to rot. Rot is caused by many things, but is often the result of previously damaged potatoes and poor ventilation that allow mold and or bacteria to take hold, so good ventilation is also required. Depending on your storage space, you may have to protect your tubers from pests while also keeping them ventilated, perhaps with a container with holes drilled in it covered with an old screen as shown here. The layers of landscape fabric on top of the screen block the small amount of light that gets in the storage shed, while still also providing decent ventilation. Just like you did during curing, inspect your potatoes regularly and pull out any that are going bad before they can infect others. Rot often shows itself in one small place that belies its deeper extent, like in this tuber that initially showed only one small spot of rot, but very quickly dissolved into a wet piece of mush once I handled it. Checking them every few days is probably ideal, but once a week is probably more realistic. So, dark, 40 to 45 degrees, 90% humidity, and good ventilation? This seems like a tough ask, especially if you don't already have a great root cellar. Achieving this brings up a plethora of underground storage options. For more ideas on these options, I suggest an oldie but goodie, Stocking Up by Carol Hupping and the staff of the Rodell Food Center, which is filled with all kinds of great ideas for storing fruits and vegetables, from freezing and canning recipes, tips, and tricks, to plenty of underground storage ideas, including more common approaches like the cellar steps, window wells, separate basement rooms, and root cellars, and more advanced approaches like how to create the ideal root cellar with built-in storage boxes, and creating buried box, straw bale, and mounted storage caches. If this is too much for you, here's my own 2 cents on what you can do. Put them in the coolest, darkest, best ventilated place you have, and add a pan of shallow water to increase humidity. Once there, inspect them weekly and adjust as needed based on what you've learned. If they show signs of greening, darken the location or move them to a darker one. If they're sprouting, move them to a cooler spot. If they're shriveling, add another shallow pan of water. If they're rotting, increase the ventilation, maybe even with a fan nearby. And try not to stress yourself too much about any of it. And for the average person buying them from the store, just do your best to mimic these conditions. Maybe in a dark cupboard that's a little cooler and still decently ventilated. And just don't buy much more than you'll use in 2 or 3 weeks or so. Also, if a person really wants long-term storage, fall harvests seem to make more sense. Potatoes are typically planted in the spring and are ready for harvest in early to mid-August. Harvesting then means trying to find an ideal storage place during the heat of summer, which is a tall order for folks in most regions. There are 2 options. Plant potatoes later, 100 to 120 days before the first fall frost, for a fall harvest, so between June 15th and July 15th depending on your area, which can be a hard time to get seed potatoes in some spots. Or plant as usual, but with no rush, and just delay your harvest until the fall. In years we've waited to harvest, we had the best winter storage. I always worry about potatoes lost underground, because some will rot, but it seems we lose far fewer than we do when we harvest early and try to keep them cool during the late summer heat spells. If you plan to harvest a while after the vines have died back, just take a minute to mark their locations with small stakes as they start to die, so you'll know where to dig later. The vines degrade so quickly it's sometimes hard to tell where they were even a few weeks after they've completely dried back.
Together, those simple secrets are the keys to having the best keeping potatoes for the longest amount of time. Amongst them, hopefully you found answers for all of your particular potato storage needs. As always, check out our Twitter, Instagram, and website. For garden calendar reminders, Jen's beautiful pictures, and more information on all of these topics. I'll put links to each of them in the description. Like this video if it was helpful, comment or ask questions if you have any. I personally respond to each one. Subscribe below for future Green Thumb gardening secrets, and until next time, stay open to growing.